So the book, 10 flashpoints in 20 years. The book is divided into chapters from 1998, on India's nuclear capacity to how it looks at China, Pakistan. So I'll try to go chapter by chapter, or at least a few of the questions. But before I start the session, I would like to request both of you to just make some introductory remarks on the book itself, and of course, on how you perceive the current national security scene. It's on.
Good evening. I enjoyed reading the book because it was my good fortune that part of my professional career, I was for 5 years part of the national security system. So the book actually, as I read it, and since there is a flow of time, every part of that book was actually also part of my, in many ways, my professional life. So I had that intimacy with the events that he describes so well. But what I really enjoyed about it was the fact that it was being written by somebody who was part of the political and policy ecosystem when these events were also taking place. And his insight and his perspective was definitely varied from mine. And I wanted to ask, and I keep that open to him, whether when he wrote this book, was he writing it as a politician, purely as a politician, or was he also writing it as somebody who had a politician with a strategic mindset? And I think the strategic mindset is evident as he writes that book. Because what probably, as he says, if politicians in India could actually get themselves out of retail politics and look at the larger picture, then maybe the question that he raises in the book will have a different answer. Because the fundamental question he raises in the book is, has India learned from its experiences? Have the lessons been applied? Are we safer than we were when we made the decisions we took at that point in time? And his answer is no, because he says in the book that we don't seem to learn. The time and again we seem to make the same mistakes. And I would think that the issue really which he brings out in the book, and which I think we must hear from him, is one of the larger issues which we need to take note of, is the fact that the political patronage for national security is sporadic, and that's his words, tactical, and episodic. But yet at the same time, the remarkable part of the book, and I quite agree with what he says, is that there needs to be a supervision of the parliamentary system on the executive, who actually takes all the decisions on national security. Right now, the national security system is run by an oligarchy, which is in the PMO, and there is no parliamentary oversight. And I think this is a major point which he makes in the book, and I completely agree with him. Of course, as you would know, he has actually twice moved a private member's bill on the supervision of the intelligence system itself, and especially when Pegasus was in force, he had moved it again. But it was a private member's bill, and his own party itself probably did not support him as they should. So I thought one of the things which I would like to actually, the importance of the book is what India lacks is that we need to have some sort of parliamentary oversight over the executive on national security decisions. And I think this is a very important point which he makes. The second thing which I would like to flag is the fact that he starts the book with India going nuclear. And then that nuclear overhang is there over the incidents, especially when it comes to terrorism from Pakistan. So one of the things the book raises is, what is the utility of force while dealing with Pakistan, which is using terror as an instrument of policy? Because while he says, and in fact, he is in disagreement with his party that after the Bombay attacks, we should have actually gone to war with the Pakistanis, which we didn't. But he also makes a statement that after Uri and Pulwama, what we did make no difference to what we wanted to achieve. And then he makes the third point, that all this is okay, force, the utility of force, but how do you deal with somebody, with a state like Pakistan, where the moment you start having a dialogue, you invite a terrorist attack and you're back to square one. But he still believes, and I think that's the politician in him, that there is no way forward other than a dialogue. And I think this is something which is a conundrum for India itself, that how do you deal with a state like this? And of course, the third point which I actually would like to highlight is, how does India deal with China? To cut a long story short, he gives a lot of history behind it. He says both Nehru and Modi have been backstabbed and double-crossed, and yet we do not seem to learn. And therefore, he suggests a very strong attitude towards dealing with China. And the last part of the book, of course, ends up with a chapter called Kashmir, the Dormant Volcano. And of course, that's because of the Article 370, and he brings out the dangers which that poses. And his way of dealing with it is about the people and the political parties who have stood with India in this course of time. So when I read this book, I don't think you can get in one place what all Manish has written. And it gives you a good insight on how India has dealt with, of course, from a particular point of view of as a Congress politician, as a politician with strategic insight. It's really is an interesting reading of what it is. And the lesson which we brings out is, why don't we learn? Why is it that the reforms that we actually have to undertake has not been done? Announced, yes. So I got the same feeling because when I was part of the system, I used to tell people, it looks like we know what is to be done, but we cannot get it done. And I think one of the reasons, I agree with him, that you cannot get it done unless it has political push behind it. There is no way, otherwise the people who created the problem can solve it themselves. And on that note, I think I'll hand it over to Manish.
I would like to add a question to the introductory remarks. Comes from what Mr. Menon said. Something which struck me when I read the book, your dual roles of a politician and a strategic thinker. How did you reconcile both these roles while writing, especially the chapter on 2611? Did at some point of time you become more of a politician while writing the chapter, but towards the end, your conclusion, of course, like you pointed out, you don't entirely agree with what the government did at that time. So how did you keep reconciling those two thoughts?
First of all, allow me to commence by thanking both the Bangalore International Center and Takshashila Institution, Mr. Ravi Chandra, Mr. Nitin Pai, for putting this event together in Bangalore. May I also recognize the presence of Mrs. Nirupma Rao, Mrs. Lata Reddy, Mr. Anand Arni, and a lot of other very profound strategic thinkers in this auditorium today. May I also thank General Prakash Menon and Dhanya Yu for agreeing to do this discussion. And the moment I walked in, Dhanya told me that I have blocked her on Twitter. And so therefore, to her, my apologies, both profound and sincere. But I said I would go and check because I usually don't block people. But
I do get blocked a lot, so I wasn't very surprised. But I was surprised by him.
But be that as it may, let me just try and contextualize how this book came about. Well, I was actually trying to write another book, a book essentially dealing with what our security approach should be over the next decade. And since COVID-19 gave you enough flexibility, since everyone was bound down, to think through certain things which otherwise, frankly, retail politics doesn't give you either the bandwidth or the mind space to do it. After having written the first chapter of that book, I realized that it had no context. And so therefore, this book really came about by accident because I thought, let me put a context to it. And when I thought about putting a context to it, it was about a timeline. Where do you start? Do you start right at the beginning, in 1947, or do you start a little later? And I thought that maybe 2 decades and India's second nuclear test may perhaps be a good starting point to contextualize our journey over the past 2 decades. And then, of course, if there is a subsequent book, this becomes the context for it. Basically, there are 5 large themes which are undercurrents which run through this book. The first is that India has not been able to break out of its neighborhood since 1947. The baggage of partition, Quay, Pakistan, and the unsettled borders, Quay, China, and there, of course, Mrs. Nirupma Rao's recent book, The Fractured Himalaya, is really an extraordinary masterpiece about how our relationship evolved between 1947 and 1962. But the fact remains that these 2 particular neighbors that we have not allowed us to break out of our neighborhood. Number 2, it's my belief that India needs space for consolidation. We need 30 years to be able to surmount the internal challenges that we face. And for that, we need peace on our periphery. And a prerequisite for that peace is to find a modus vivendi, both with Pakistan and China. It is not easy, but I don't think there is any other way except doing that. The third theme is that if India really has to punch to its potential, India has to really grow and become the economic powerhouse which it has the potential to do and Bangalore, of course, being the startup capital and the information technology capital of the country, leads in many ways in that particular area. South Asia has to integrate itself. And unfortunately, the India-Pakistan gridlock is the biggest impediment in the integration of South Asia, both economic as well as the infrastructure integration of South Asia. And till the point in time that doesn't happen, till the time we are not able to create, well, at least a free trade area amongst ourselves, and start actually looking at a borderless paradigm, at least with regard to the travel of goods and services, we in South Asia will never be able to achieve our potential. The fourth is that there's a mismatch between our national security challenges and our national security expenditure. Either we have to bring down our national security challenges or substantively ramp up our national security expenditure, of which the biggest component is our defense expenditure. And as you are aware, though there are many justifications trotted out by the government, but the fact is that it's been a declining trajectory from almost 2012 onwards as a percentage of GDP. It just goes up slightly, but we are nowhere near the challenges that we have. And finally, there is this whole elephant in the room about civil-military relations. And that's a relationship which needs to be finished and tended with care. The two episodes, one pertaining to Admiral Bhagwat when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister, the other pertaining to General V.K. Singh when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, demonstrate as to how fragile and delicate this relationship is and how quickly susceptible it can become to misunderstanding. And we are currently seeing the spectre playing itself out, that after the unfortunate demise of General Bipin Rawat in that helicopter crash, we've not had a CDS for 4 months now. And so obviously there seem to be trust issues between the government and whosoever they want to possibly put as the CDS, and therefore there is this question of institutionalization, which unfortunately in this case, when you created the position of CDS in December of 2019, obviously seems to be missing. And then of course the final theme is that for Pakistan it all goes back to Bangladesh in 1971. Till the time Pakistan does not surmount that that scar on their national psyche, the humiliation of 1971, our efforts to try and find that peace may not be fruitful. So therefore, these are really the 5 big themes which I have attempted to address as a substratum. The rest, of course, is more anecdotal. It's about how the flow of events really took place, my personal recollections on some of them. And I do feel that, and that's why I said that this book is not really aimed at practitioners and people who have spent a lifetime in the service of this country. It's more aimed at my colleagues in Parliament, in the legislatures, to try and sensitize them about the bigger challenges which this country faces, and to try and see as to how we can use the legislative institutions in order to address some of these issues, which unfortunately do not come up in our public discourse. For example, and I'll end with that, we've had the standoff with China since April 2020. At the last count, 37 of my parliament questions were rejected at the threshold, saying that they are too sensitive to be answered on grounds of national security. And it's not only happened to me, it's happened to Dr. Subramaniam Swamy also, it's happened to a whole bunch of us. So there seems to be an inherent distrust in the executive when it comes to trusting even the supreme legislative institutions on the sensitive questions of national security. And I think that does not augur well for a healthy democracy, and I do not know how much of a democracy are we left, really. But be that as it may, that's a separate discussion. So I think those are the kind of things which this book has really attempted to address. And to answer your question, yes, that was a dilemma for me. Because I'm a practicing politician. I was making value judgments on certain decisions that my own government had taken. And therefore, how do I address that? And therefore, I decided to become government agnostic. So I wasn't looking at UPA, QA, NDA, or anything of that sort. I was just looking at events as they unfolded and our national responses to them. And so therefore, that allowed me to be dispassionate to the extent that I could, possibly given whatever ideological predilections that I have. But to answer your question, yes, I never looked at it in terms of whether I was addressing something that had happened during the tenure of the NDA or the UPA. I was just looking at a situation and seeing what our responses were. And in hindsight, we always get it right in hindsight, what possibly we could have done better.
So the first chapter is about 1998, the testing times. You speak a lot about the politics from Narasimha Rao to Atal Bihari Vajpayee and why Narasimha Rao government could not go ahead with the test, but it was Atal Bihari Vajpayee government which did. And something which Mr. Menon also ended his note with, he said the political push, which is also what you said, the political push which the BJP government had then. How do you perceive that vis-a-vis what happens now? There is for people like me who do not follow national security as much as most people in this audience, there is a perception that conservative governments across the world can push some of these harsh decisions because they can also control the narratives around it. So what happened in 1998 to what is happening in India today, how do you perceive?
Well, before I answer that question, I think we are at a unique and unfortunate moment in history where, given what is going on in Ukraine, you may actually have nuclear taboos being broken. Because given the way Russia is almost being pushed into a corner with very unclear war aims and with more ambiguous battlefield objectives, you may unfortunately have a situation, if this drags on for a very long time, which could actually shatter the status quo that prevailed after Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. I think that's a real fear that we should be cognizant about. I hope it does not come to that pass, but I guess we are fairly close to it. To answer your question, you see, after all, the first nuclear explosion was carried out by Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And if you dehorse the period of emergency, she was not really an authoritarian leader in that sense of the word. So to say that conservative governments are able to control narratives better, I would tend to disagree. And there's a very interesting paragraph in that chapter where I talk about that what really brought Mr. Vajpayee to that decision. Was it because of the long-standing commitment that the Jansangh and then the Bharatiya Janata Party had to the bomb, going back all the way to the first Chinese test in 1964? Or was it because it was an extremely shaky government? And so therefore, nothing focuses the collective energies and attention of a government which is pulling in all directions if it is confronted with a crisis as big as what the nuclear explosion did create. So that's why I've said, if I recall correctly from the top of my head, that the minds of politicians function in strange ways. So I think, unfortunately, all the dramatis persona who were involved in that decision, late Mr. Brajesh Mishra or Mr. Jaswant Singh, those who were privy to how it really played out, and of course President Kalam and some of the people who were instrumental in operationalizing it, since they've not come out publicly, would not really know what the inflection point was. But to be fair to the Vajpayee government, after they carried out the tests in 1998, I think they managed the fallout fairly well. In fact, that extended multi-continent dialogue which Jaswant Singh had with Stroop Talbot, and the next steps in strategic partnership which came about in 2003, is a manifestation of the fact that the fallout was well managed. But you see, there are learnings. Unfortunately, you have the first stage nuclear powers, the P5, and then you have the second age nuclear powers, India, Pakistan, North Korea, which are de jure nuclear powers. And of course, there are others who have recessed capabilities. And I think the learnings of the first nuclear age have not really been transmitted to the second nuclear age. You know, you recently saw what happened with the BrahMos missile which landed in Pakistan. Now, this could have actually triggered off a serious accident. And unfortunately, notwithstanding that we live cheek to jowl and the missile flying time is 5 to 7 minutes, there is absolutely no dialogue between our strategic force commanders. You know, there is no institutionalized dialogue on nuclear issues, except for that exchange of lists on 1st of January every year. So I think there are issues which need to be addressed, but you know, these are those elephants in the room which nobody really wants to see, much less touch and feel.
You also speak about the no first use policy and how after the BJP government came into power this time, there has been a small deflection from what even the Vajpayee government believed. And you have quoted the manifesto, then how Rajnath Singh went back on it, then the book by Shiv Shankar Menon. Do you believe that the government is ambiguous about the no first use policy, or do you believe that initially with that whole comment which Rajnath Singh clarified, that doubt is no longer there?
So there are two separate aspects of it. There are two separate buckets. One is the politics of it. And of course, then is the quintessential classical dilemma which Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon points to in his book Choices, where he talks about, you know, if a practitioner unfortunately has to take the call. I think in the case of the former, the BJP was just trying to be a little more muscular than they should have been on a sensitive issue in the 2014 manifesto, which then there was a very strong pushback and Mr. Rajnath Singh was forced to clarify. And subsequently, of course, when late Mr. Parrikar was the defense minister, I think he was just kind of doing some kite flying, trying to get headlines the next morning. It's never ever happened that the defense minister is contradicted by his own ministry, you know, whereby a PRO actually issues a press release saying that the minister's views were his own personal views. So that's unprecedented. And of course, you know, Mr. Rajnath Singh in 2019, after visiting Pokhran, put out a very ambiguous tweet. So I guess there is a certain instinct, if not a thinking, in the echelons of this government with regard to what India's nuclear posture should be. But I think the posture that we put into place in 1999 with the draft nuclear doctrine, which was then formalized in 2003, which has held the field across administrations, different administrations, is the correct posture. I think it holds up India as a responsible nuclear power. You have China, which also has a recessed nuclear posture. So under those circumstances, this kite flying, I think, is avoidable, but they seem to have settled down because after 2019, they've really been not very much of of noise about it. Of course, they've been distracted with various other things which have been happening. Of course, Mr. Shivshankar Menon's book did create some waves. Vipin Narang and some other people thought that this was actually a revision of India's nuclear posture, which of course Mr. Menon has subsequently clarified that's not the case. And he just possibly alluded to some of the dilemmas, and which are realistic dilemmas. So in my estimation, I think the posture elaborated in 1999 or even before that, when we were a de facto nuclear power, is the correct posture.
Mr.
Why did you ask
Yes,
Mr. Menon
yeah.
that?
And I also want to add, do you also believe it's just kite flying muscular posturing? And I do know that Takshashila has been saying that there should be a global no first use policy. So in light of what's happening in the world now with the war, could you also talk about that?
Yeah, actually, he mentions in the book about Prime Minister Manmohan Singh calling for a GNFU, a global no first use treaty. But he leaves it there on that call. But I think, it's an idea whose time has come, especially with what we are witnessing in Ukraine. I mean, everybody knows, and they've said it also together just recently, the nuclear powers, the recognized nuclear powers, have said that, nobody can fight a nuclear war and can win it. I mean, this is what they say. So any use of nuclear weapons by anybody would, in my view, not be intentional. It can only be accidental. And like that missile which got fired into Pakistan, as far as military tensions are concerned, and once military forces are locked in an action-reaction scenario, I think we got to revisit Clausewitz, who called it friction and the fog of war. Anything can happen. It may not be intentional, it would be accidental. That is the greater danger. But that is danger itself. I mean, so the point is, it's time now for India, and if you can get China on board to actually, you could have actually taken that India can lead this with China on a global no first use. We are the only two powers who believe in it. The fact that Shivshankar Menon raised an issue where he said that suppose you know for sure that he is going to fire on you, then maybe you will fire first. But the problem with that is you can never know for sure unless you know what is inside the minds of the guy who's controlling nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons have got alert levels. The moment they come into alert levels, a guy who can see, yes, he's getting ready. But is he going to use it? It's impossible really to know unless you can know the mind of the other person. So, the situation which Shivshankar Menon described, it's possible theoretically, practically it would be very difficult. So, but the thing of what NFU is based on the fact, on the fundamental the core role of nuclear weapons is to deter others from using you against us. That is the core role. Otherwise, you don't need to have nuclear weapons. If you adhere to the core role, and this is what they're saying publicly, after all, there is this, the nuclear powers are the ones who have to sustain the NPT, and so they put out the statement just before the NPT was supposed to be convened. Of course, it's been delayed now, saying that, we all say that we should not fight and we cannot win this war. They all say that. But it's just lip service, because the point is like this, that nuclear weapons cannot be used physically, but they can be used psychologically. Pakistan uses it all the time. The very fact that most of you think that India-Pakistan situation is the greatest nuclear danger in the world itself is wrong. It is something which Pakistan has actually sold to the world, that this is the most dangerous place because we have nuclear weapons. Because every time anything happens, the first thing they do is they'll convene a meeting of their nuclear command. What is the message? The nuclear weapons are going to come into play. Exactly what Putin had actually done before he started the Ukraine war. It was a shield which he was holding up. He said, Anybody who's intervened will have to actually face, the type of weapons which we have. So the point is, unless the powers which, like India, which are no first use, and we can get a support from the rest of the world, because this is only a halfway home. It's not about getting rid of nuclear weapons. That in the realist world, I think we have to wait for another, God knows, unless a nuclear weapon is fired, I don't think that's going to actually stop. So the point at issue is, we have an opportunity here. And that's why Takshashila has been vigorously pointing out that we should be the ones who should be leading this effort, because we are well poised to do that. Whether Mohan Parikar made that comment or Rajnath made that comment, of course it was, I think the politician would know how those comments are, come out. And it came out of nowhere. I was there at that book ceremony of the launch. It came out of nowhere, frankly speaking, but it came from his heart, that's for sure. That's what he felt. And of course, Rajnath was a reply to a question. Will it happen in the future? He says, future? Who knows? Then it became, India is going to change its no first use policy. So I think we've got to take it with a pinch of salt.
Taking it with a pinch of salt. Now the chapter on Kargil, an eye-opener. I have to rush through because we have to allow the audience to ask questions at least for half an hour. So in this chapter, you speak about the final problem, which you say about the intelligence system is that the infrastructure lacks a legislative oversight. And you've spoken about why you moved the private members bill in the Lok Sabha twice. What is your suggestion as to how should the intelligent apparatus in India, how should the legislative oversight happen? Because you've spoken about an ombudsman and things like that. So if you could explain that to the audience. And what really are the constitutional safeguards that we have against when the intelligence system functions? 2 days ago, Home Minister Amit Shah was in Bangalore when he said that we will have a lot of data collection to look at Hawala networks and for the national and to strengthen the national security system. We keep speaking about data collection, but where is the protection of the data collected? So two things really, and also because you are a member of the Parliament Committee of the Data Protection Bill.
So, well, let me answer that in reverse because data protection may be of more interest to Bangalore. I don't think that this government is seriously interested in bringing a data protection bill because that bill has been done. It has to go from the Joint Committee of Parliament directly back to Parliament. So therefore, any amendments which government has to move, they have to move them as official amendments on the floor of the House. So it's different from the standing committee process where government can actually, reject what the standing committees recommend. So the data protection bill is done and dusted. Now, where the data protection bill really collides is with this entire Orwellian surveillance system which this government is trying to build up. So therefore you had the, criminal identification bill, which they had brought before the last session of Parliament. You've had amendments to the UAPA. You've had amendments to various other laws. And the focus of all those amendments is singularly data and more data. So therefore, there is a belief in this government that eventually the way forward is to try and suck in as much of data as possible and then use it for profiling purposes. Now, there's this fundamental problem with that because you have the Puttaswamy judgment. And the Puttaswamy judgment says, and Supreme Court 9-0 had said it, that the right to privacy is a fundamental right. So they've read it into Article 21. So what the government really has been doing since 2019 flies in the face of what is the law of the land that you and I have a right to privacy. So there is, and every time this has come up, because whenever the Home Minister has brought something of this sort, I've had the privilege of opening that debate from the opposition benches, and each time we've flagged that there is a singular problem. Like, for example, the latest one which has been brought with regard to the criminal identification bill. Now, it's so ambiguously worded. Some of the definitional concepts are so ambiguous that it legitimizes, narco testing, it legitimizes brain mapping. The Home Minister said on the floor of the House, oh, it precludes this, but that is not true. Some of the other safeguards which was there in the Prisoners Identification Bill of Act of 1921, that, below, if let us suppose you are charged, if you are named in an FIR, but if you've not been summoned for investigation and arrested, you cannot be profiled. But this particular law does away with that also. And so therefore that's another discussion altogether. But there is a fundamental transgression which is taking place on a daily basis. This whole idea of trying to, create the 360-degree ecosystem, which of course Mr. Chidambaram also had this great idea of NatGrid, link PAN and Aadhaar and your bank numbers and your voter ID. So it's all about 360-degree profiling, and I don't think that kind of power should rest in the hands of any government. I mean, that's my personal belief. Insofar, you see, intelligence is concerned, because you refer to Kargil, that intelligence failure was not flagged by me. That was flagged by the Kargil Review Committee. In fact, Mr. Subramaniam in that report was extremely scathing in his indictment about the intelligence failure, which I think I have quoted. And going forth, when the group of ministers which dealt with it, and unfortunately, whatever parts of that report are available in the public space, they make no sense because very heavily redacted. And then, of course, you had the Naresh Chandra committee, which looked at it 10 years down the line, and that report is also not in the public space at all. So I think we still continue to pursue a very siloized approach. And of course, there is legitimate apprehension. I remember when I did the private members bill for the first time, we spoke to all the practitioners. The Observer Research Foundation was helping me. We convened, people who had headed these organizations at the apex level. And there was this legitimate apprehension that, how can we entrust national security into the hands of politicians? I mean, they will then try and get into operational stuff, which would then compromise our operations, and there were all legitimate concerns. So, in fact, parliamentary oversight is a very small part of that bill. The real thrust of that bill is to actually set these agencies on a legislative footing. Right? Across the world, intelligence agencies are empowered and legislated by acts of their respective legislature, which is something which is missing in our case. And that's why the Guwahati High Court in 2013 struck down the CBI as an illegal organization. And since 2013, the Supreme Court has not legislated on it, has not adjudicated on it, for the simple reason that it will be very difficult for the Supreme Court to overturn that Guwahati High Court judgment. So we have a fundamental problem when we deal with the legislative basis of both our law enforcement agencies and our intelligence structures. And therefore, in terms of legislative oversight, that's why I had pegged it at a level, Speaker of the Lok Sabha, Chairperson of the Council of States, Leader of Opposition. So therefore, that's as responsible as you can get, in the legislative space. And of course, there were safeguards with regard to, precluding the operational part of it. And to General Menon's earlier comment, in fact, we actually, General, did come fairly close to a very robust discussion in the UPA government. I recall before I went into government, Mr. T.K. Nair and Mr. Shivshankar Menon had called me aside and said that there was some reception at the Prime Minister's residence, and said that, look, we are seriously considering and having in-house deliberations, but of course, then it eventually went nowhere because I guess the pushback within the system was very strong. But this is an idea whose time has come. Ultimately, like every other not only civilized democracy, even authoritarian states, they have a legislative basis. We unfortunately continue to function under very ambiguous paradigms.
Before I go to General Menon and ask his opinion on the legislative oversight for intelligence, I want to go back on the data question one more time. What I want to ask is, there is always a talk about getting more data, whether it's amendment to the UAPA bill, the criminal identification bill, and what the Home Minister said. Now, vis-a-vis privacy, you have explained. But my doubt is also, there is so much of talk about collecting data for national security or other purposes. But is there really any serious consideration on protecting this data, not just for the sake of privacy, but also from others? Like, this data can be accessed, used by others. How are we looking into that?
You see, all data is held by government in a fiduciary capacity. For example, if you look at the Income Tax Act, the Income Tax Act had a provision analogous with the right to information going back to 1961, which said that, I think it's Section 139 of the Income Tax Act, where they said that in certain situations, even if you ask for my income tax data, and if the government is satisfied it is a larger public interest, it can be released. So therefore, there is an estoppel. In fact, there's a legal estoppel that within government also, among different law enforcement agencies, you cannot really share data. They do it all the time on an informal basis, but it has no legislative backing at all. So therefore, the data protection regimes in this country are completely non-existent. So unfortunately, you see, as when we were doing the data protection bill, one of my colleagues told me, he says, here you're talking about digital data. We live in a country where, people unfortunately don't have the dignity of even being able to perform their ablutions privately. So what kind of privacy are we really talking about? So, for a large number of people, even within our committee, to be able to grasp that there is something called data privacy which needs to be protected was frankly a completely alien concept. And I think that's a mindset which really pervades across the entire citizenry कि मैं कुछ गलत थोड़ी कर रहा हूँ. So अगर मेरा data सरकार लेना भी चाहे, so they can take it. So therefore that fundamental mindset that I have nothing to hide, I'm an open book, that is also, I think, a very, very big impediment in creating that kind of public pressure, which would ensure that this right to privacy actually becomes a substantive right.
General Menon, do you believe that the intelligence system in the country should have a legislative oversight? And some of the other suggestions which has been put forward in the bill. What are your own thoughts about it?
See, I think the conceptual foundations of a democracy has to be based on the supremacy of parliament over the executive. They are the elected people. So I think if you look at that issue, the very fact that the questions asked by the parliamentarians is being sandbagged because it is a matter of national security, which only the executive actually, therefore, is in control, reflects on that poor foundation. We need to change it. Especially now, since you're talking about in the context of intelligence, how can you and why should you give power to a small group, an oligarchy which exists within all governments without oversight? And who is better competent for oversight than the parliamentarians? But there, I would actually like to ask him, do we have the quality of politicians or parliamentarians who can actually be part of that oversight? Do we have that quantity which we would like to have? I'm sure they are, given the opportunity. But the point is, if today the parliamentarians are part of a party system and the structural nature of that system today does not allow parliamentarians independence of thought. This is an attack on democracy itself as far as national security is concerned. Because unless you empower the elected people, they will only be able to speak what the party wants them to speak, and that happens to be a weakness. So I would completely endorse that you should have oversight, whether the politicians are good enough or not. I think that's a matter of time. Even if they are not, they probably live up to the job. It is absolutely necessary.
Let me answer that question with regard to do we have people who are qualified and responsible to exercise that oversight? In fact, that was a huge dilemma going back to 2010 when I was doing the bill, and which is why I elaborated that we decided to peg it at the highest levels of the legislature, because that's how responsible or irresponsible that you can get, with the Speaker of the House and the Vice President of India and, of course, leaders of the opposition in both houses. But to answer General Menon's question, you're right. Unfortunately, the 10th schedule of the Constitution has taken, conscience, constituency and common sense out of the legislative institutions. But notwithstanding that, in the standing committee formats, we work in a fairly multi-partisan manner. So therefore, that rancor that you see on the floor of the House is completely missing when the standing committees meet. I mean, I'm in Bangalore for the Standing Committee of Finance. So therefore, that's all multi-partisan, that's all cutting across party lines, looking at issues objectively. And in fact, one of the biggest successes of the parliament system has been the standing committee process going back to 1993 when Mr. Shivraj Patil started it. Yes, on contentious issues, at times you get divided. Right? I remember I was on the Joint Committee of Parliament, the Joint Parliamentary Committee, which looked into the 2G, the whole telecom issue. And of course, that was a completely polarized parliamentary committee. But, that was because the entire issue at stake was, was something which was very different. But otherwise, people can tend to be fairly responsible.
No, I would agree with that, especially with my experience with the Standing Committee on Defense. And if you really look at it, and all that is available, they really make very sound recommendations. But what is the problem? The problem is it's ignored by the executive. The type of answers which are given to these committees really, it's about the fact that, we know, we are looking at it, it's already been looked at. So what I'm saying is, here the structural problem is that the executive has taken for itself power which the people have not given to them. The people's power rests with the parliamentarians. But that they've been deprived of. That's the point I make.
So before I go to the audience for the questions, as a journalist, I have to ask you this. In various chapters, you have spoken about media management, whether it's by the UPA, by the BJP, NDA governments. During Kargil, you spoke about how the Vajpayee government literally opened the war to the TV cameras. But when it came to the Modi government, your contention is that they open it up to TV cameras or whoever, to how much of information they want to give. Has media management, what do you think of the media management that is happening now? And do you think it has come to a stage where the narrative has been built in such a way that even for the media, it has become difficult to question, even if they want to? For example, when the BrahMos missile mishap happened, I don't think a lot of people were asking the questions they should have, because it would be perceived very differently, because there is a whole talk about nationalism and how, when it comes to how India deals with other countries, certain questions cannot be asked. So has the Modi government really done so well in media management that now even critiquing the government has become tough for the media?
Well, it all boils down to whether you have the conviction of courage. I raised the BrahMos issue in the Lok Sabha. I, in fact, critiqued the government, saying that, you unfortunately could have ended up with a disaster on your hands, which would have been unmanageable given the fact that that missile flew through airspace which was extremely heavily populated with airplanes. And in fact, in one of my regular pieces, I had alluded to what the Tracker 24 had to say about the airspace position at that point in time. So, therefore, eventually it boils down to whether you believe that something should be raised or not. But I agree with you that there is a hugely oppressive atmosphere which has been created. And I don't blame the journalists for that. Because
you do talk about the dilemma for political parties in the opposition too. For example, the fine balance of critiquing but not over-critiquing.
See, the reality is that there is no freedom of the press in India. There's never been freedom of the press in India. It's always been the freedom of the owner of the press and the delegated freedom enjoyed by the manager of the press. That unfortunately is the situation going back to the days of the jute press. My colleague, Mr. Vijay Sharma, is here. He and I worked together in the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. In fact, he spent many, many more years than I did. And, he can regale you with stories about how completely and absolutely the back end of the media and the imperatives that the owners have are totally different from what, the perception of a layman about what the media should be. But having said that, Mr. Vajpayee, when the Kargil War took place, actually dealt with it very transparently. He allowed people to go to the front lines. He allowed them to, cover the war. Yes, there were some mishaps. I remember, Barkha having some panic moments because, her phone became a subject of controversy. But be that as it may, it was very transparent. 2611 was anarchic. I mean, in the sense you had a real-time operation being second-guessed by 800 journalists out there. And so therefore the handlers in Pakistan actually did not need spotters on the ground. All they had to do was, see Indian television, which was trying to second guess and predict every move that the government is going to make. So therefore, that kind of a situation is completely and absolutely out of line. In fact, I've written about it that, why didn't we have at least deferred coverage by an hour or something if we did not really want to put a squeeze on it. But insofar as this government is concerned, it completely takes the cake. And the information blackout on the border situation with China, even today, 20 months down the line, is absolute. And no journalist and no media organization worth its salt has even ventured to Leh to find out as to what is happening. So the specter of coercion, terror and intimidation is real. And it's, as I said, it is not the fault of the journalists. Because ultimately, Indian media is corporate-owned media. And corporates are extremely vulnerable to all kinds of pressure. And they use these pressure points extremely well. Every government does it, but it's always a question of degrees. Here we seem to have gone completely overboard.
General Menon, your thoughts, neither a politician nor a journalist. So how do you look at the media management? Is it an information blackout now? Have we gone overboard, as Mr. Tiwari says?
Can I skip this question?
Sure.
I think it's a matter of opinion, but the feeling is we have a subdued media, and I think that says it all.
Subdued media. We'll move to questions from the audience if anyone wants to ask a question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. It's been an exceptional discussion, and to hear both from a politician and, of course, General Menon, who's a leading strategic expert. And the first question, when you talk about parliamentary oversight and joint standing committees, do you think there's a case for India to have select committees of the kind that exist in the United Kingdom and Australia, given that India is a Westminster Whitehall system of governance, and where select committees take evidence from politicians, and it's the equivalent of answering house. So if you lie to select committee, you really commit a breach of parliament. And select committees take evidence from the public, and since India has a robust infrastructure of think tanks today, wouldn't it only make sense for there to be select committees working in the same way as they do in UK, which are cross-partisan and which do some excellent work?
Okay.
And that's the first question. Secondly, when you talk about civil-military relations, I mean, there's a whole larger question of political-administrative interface. So civil-military really only becomes a subset of that. So that's the whole political and particularly again, given that India has a Westminster Whitehall system, I mean, do we really see episodes of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister really being played out in real life in India? Thank you.
Well, thank you for both those questions. They're great questions. We already have a select committee paradigm. So there are select committees of both the houses which look at specific issues. There are also joint select committees of both the houses together, which especially look at legislation, which may not really sound very kosher when they're tabled in the House. So we already have that tradition, and the joint select committees or the select committees or even the standing committees, they actually take evidence from people, they consult think tanks. In fact, there is a pre-legislative stakeholder consultation policy which has been on the books since 2013, if I recall correctly. Unfortunately, this government has not been following it. Otherwise, the practice was that even before legislation is incubated in government, there is a stakeholder consultation which takes place, much like what the Telecom Regulatory Authority or the other regulators do before they put out their recommendations. And so, yes, we have this system, but the real problem is the emasculation of the legislature. So therefore, unfortunately, India is turning into a democracy where you don't really require a parliament. Unfortunately, parliamentarians or legislators themselves are to blame for this situation to a certain extent. But if you really look at it, the Indian democracy, now almost going back 3 decades or more, is an executive-driven, judicially supervised democracy where the role of the legislature is very inhibited. And number 2, on civil-military relations, I tend to entirely agree with you. It's a subset of the larger political administrative interface. But why civil-military relations become critical is primarily because, unlike other aspects of the political or politician administrative interface, here you are dealing with people who have been entrusted either with external security responsibilities or internal security responsibilities, and they do have at their disposal a fair amount of firepower, which, if turned in a different direction, can easily lead you down the path of Pakistan or even Bangladesh or some of our other neighbors. And that's why I said that this particular relationship has to be finished, managed carefully. And there have been, if you go back to even General Cariappa's time onwards, there have been hiccups. We've been able to smoothen it over, but it's not been a ride which has been very smooth.
Any more questions? And before someone moves, I have a question to ask. The book does speak a lot about the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff, and you have raised a lot of questions as to the hierarchy, who prevails when decisions are made, whose decision prevails. These are questions you have asked. So why do you believe there's a lack of clarity even now when as far as CDS is concerned? And is that being addressed at all? Because we are yet to have our second CDS.
Well, I think the apprehensions that I had expressed in the December of 2019, when I wrote a piece in the Hindu, if I recall, about the role of the CDS not being very, very clearly defined, and how the Department of Military Affairs, which is going to be staffed essentially by service officers, will interface with its civilian component, and should it not have been a part of the larger reform whereby you fuse the service headquarters with MOD rather than they being attached to offices. And so therefore, when I looked at it, and the press note which had come out on the 24th of December 2019, to my mind, it seemed that it was a kind of a one-off thing that they were doing. And unfortunately, the events over the past 4 months seems to have demonstrated that there was a lack of clarity. I'm not saying that it was to kind of put a particular person in a particular slot. That would be unfair. But the fact that we've had a 4-month delay, so is actually government reconsidering whether that was the correct thing that they did? Would they like to continue with the COS system, which was prevalent from the late 50s onwards? There obviously seems to be an issue, because if there wouldn't have been an issue, and if it was just an institutionalized thing, then maybe after a decent waiting period of mourning, they would have gone and appointed another CDS, which they have not done.
Hello, welcome to Bangalore, sir. Sir, I must confess I have not read your book yet, so this topic may have been covered in the book, but since it did not come in the discussion tonight, I'd like to ask. You talk about national security pertaining to external threats, but what about internal threats like Naxalites, Marxists, Khalistanis, radical religious outfits which call for breaking of India, Hindutva organizations, the foreign-funded extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing outfits? Do you think these threats are related to national security, or they should be dealt in a very different manner?
You make a very fair point. No, the book does not deal with it, and the reason why it doesn't deal with it is because we were trying to sort of keep the narrative linear and look at the larger picture, but all the various threats that you have alluded to are real national security threats. But the greatest national security threat that we face today is the deliberate attempt to create social disharmony. I remember going back, this was 2006 at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Donald Rumsfeld, not everybody's favorite person, had made a very interesting comment. He said, money is a coward and money goes to the safest destination. And one thing which this government's not been able to figure out is that social disharmony and economic progress cannot go hand in hand. If you will have social disharmony, if you will have sectarian tensions, and unfortunately the last 3 months have been very bad, you will never have that 8% or 9% growth which India requires. It's just not going to happen. Because if you read the coverage about India in the Financial Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the other newspapers, and these are the papers which the investors read, right, when they are making investment decisions about India, it doesn't really paint a very good picture of the country. And so therefore, to my mind, that is the single biggest national security challenge that we face today. Because when you talk about minorities, it's not percentages. The real numbers are more than the populations of many countries. And so therefore, all this business about hijab and about the kind of food that you eat and stuff like that, in fact, I tweeted about it today in the morning that I hope we don't end up creating a country where we have to blindfold our children from the darkness outside. So while the threats that you talk about, yes, are real national security threats, but in today's context, I think we are sitting on a volcano, and if the government does not stop pushing this whole politics of the slow burn, we may be in a very difficult situation not very far down the road.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. And my question is really from a very layman perspective. So you mentioned that India and China have a great opportunity to leap ahead with the global no first use policy. And so you mentioned that we have a great opportunity with Pakistan in terms of, actually putting together these strategic commander force dialogues and other such institutional. So what more proactive measures might you suggest, to take a more proactive stance versus just a reactive stance? That's one question. And the second is, in the Quad, we also have strategic relationships now with the US, and there's a lot of friction coming in between US and China. So how would that weigh if we were to go ahead with something like that with China? And the most interesting question on my mind is really, what's the next step with regard to Russia? Because right now we're walking this tightrope, as we learned from the news. We don't want to offend Russia, but at the same time, we're talking about peace and dialogue. So what would be your inputs there?
That's 3 questions.
Yeah.
I think he just written about Russia, so you better tell us what you wrote.
Why don't you go first? I think some of those
Actually, the GNFU, you see, the question is, you have an idea. The idea is one which you have to keep pushing till its time comes, because you believe in the idea. At this point in time, GNFU looks a faraway objective. But that doesn't mean, because India is best positioned to do it, along with China, of course. And surely China does not recognize us as a nuclear power, so that thing at the moment is not. But we are the ones to hold that idea up. And I think we need to keep that going till the time, because we believe that's one of the ways. It's not a complete solution to nuclear weapons. At least it will make us safer than what we are now. The second question, which you actually, he talks in the book, and I think he says this repeatedly, that we need a national security doctrine. And one of the statements that he makes is also that to counter China, the USA is our best bet. How this is to be applied is a matter which actually he uses the word calibration, but it can mean anything. So he'll have to probably explain to us at how this relationship he sees. So it's over to you, Manish.
Because you do speak about the pandemic and how that's also changed some of the equations.
Look, so therefore, here's the contradiction. That we have this border standoff with China now going back to the August of 2020. Concurrently, our trade numbers with China are the highest that we've ever had. So therefore, we continue to trade with China while we have this situation where people are kind of locked eyeball to eyeball. So under those circumstances, the dilemma is that how do you really sort of finish it? And my apprehension is that it is going to become increasingly difficult, because in my estimation, the Ukrainian war is not going to end well for Russia. And Russia is going to be, even if they were to achieve whatever war objectives they have, an extremely weakened power. And so Russia as a weakened power, which is a junior partner of China, is going to make it even more difficult for you to really use the Russian hedge, qua the Chinese, and you have these huge dependencies, legacy dependencies on Russia. So therefore, that's why, despite being in a minority of two, the other one being Shashi Tharoor, the two of us had argued in the Lok Sabha when I had led the discussion on Ukraine that we need to right-size the position on Ukraine. And when I say right-size the position, you need to tell friends also, if they're wrong, that they're wrong. You can't just take this ambivalent position all the time. And I guess the Prime Minister, when he was in Europe, I guess he's coming back today, or he may have come back, would have really been sensitized to the fact that there is almost a new world order which is emerging. And it's not about taking sides, but I think we need to have a very, very frank introspection that as to where do our interests lie. Do they lie on the side of the Iron Curtain, where you will find Russia, China, Pakistan, Myanmar, and their myriad allies, or does it really lie on the side of the Western democracies, howsoever imperfect and hypocritical they may be? Minister Jaishankar recently, when at the Raisina dialogue answering a question from the Norwegian foreign minister, was a bit in the face when he said that, oh, you threw Afghanistan under a bus. So, basically saying you have double standards, which is correct. It is, he's not wrong when he says that. But that does not really answer our dilemma that if you look at India's interests 5 or 10 years down the line, with the kind of ambivalence that you've exhibited over the past 3 months, how this is going to really play out. And my sense is that it is not going to play out very well. On the larger question of how do you balance China, I think after this Ukrainian conflict is going to become all the more difficult, because Ukraine, unfortunately, is what Belgium was to the Anglo-French rivalry in the 19th century, or Poland has been to the German-Russian rivalry going back 2 centuries, or what Afghanistan was in the battle to bring down communism. So, unfortunately, Ukraine has just become a pawn, a chess piece, and that too a pawn. And the difficulty is that eventually there are going to be 2 gainers out of this conflict. One, China. And China has hugely gained out of the situation as it evolved in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., between 2001 and 2021 by not interfering. And the other is the United States of America, because it would have weakened Russia. And under those circumstances, with this new architecture emerging, we really have to think it through. And I don't think that the position that we've taken, maybe because we initially had citizens stuck there, and then, there is this natural instinct that, why should we get involved in somebody else's war? My sense is that we've not really thought it through.
Gentlemen, I read your opinion that we should not be ambivalent and India is in the position to call for a ceasefire.
The question is, and that's the point which I think he makes here, day before yesterday. What he says is, we can't afford anymore to stay neutral in this. I do not agree with that, personally. We can definitely articulate what we see is a violation of international principles, which is the sovereignty of Ukraine itself. But we know that this is essentially a fight, a European fight. We don't need to take sides, because if we take sides, we are going to take sides to our disadvantage. Russia, I would agree with him, is going to be a weakened power at the end of this, it looks like, although you never know. But let's assume that that's the greater probability. If that is the only reason, then I think we are missing the larger picture. Because if anybody is there today who's friendly both with the Russians and with the West, it is India. India, in fact, should step up and play the role that it should be playing, not take sides. Because here is an opportunity for India to actually get both these people to first stop fighting. And I'm sure that a lot of people want this to happen. So I would not agree with the proposition that because Russia is likely to be the loser here, we should move away from what the stand that we have taken. Yes, we have not called it an invasion, and we have not called out the Russians for violation of sovereignty. That I think we should have done earlier.
Before we go to the final question from the audience, I just want to open a new subject quickly. What is your opinion about federalism, national security? There have been a lot of people who have been writing that when it comes to questions of national security, certain states, for example, when it comes to Sri Lanka, should Tamil Nadu's viewpoint be taken? When it comes to Pakistan, Punjab, like that. So what do you think about federalism and national security?
Well, I think these are two entirely different situations that you alluded to. So I don't think that insofar as Pakistan is concerned, there is a different position which Punjab has from what is the position or has been the historical position of the government of India. Yes, we as a people are a little less jingoistic, primarily because the war or conflict does bring back body bags, given that we still contribute 17% to the armed forces in terms of people. So the kind of chest thumping that you would see, in some other parts of the country when temperatures kind of ratchet up, you don't see that in Punjab.
No, but right? As a policy.
So I don't think that we are kind of any different from the position that the government of India takes. But insofar as Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka are concerned, I think Tamil Nadu historically has had a position on the Sri Lankan question. Whether you like it or not, it's been a part of their domestic political discourse. So, and governments going all the way back to Mrs. Indira Gandhi have had to factor that into their Sri Lankan policy. So where you have a situation where it impinges upon your domestic politics, whether you like it or not, I mean, every day something about Sri Lanka is raised by Tamil Nadu MPs in both houses of parliament. So it's, but you don't see the same thing happening. Punjab MPs raising Pakistan, or somebody raising Afghanistan, or MPs of the Northeast actually raising Myanmar or China. So I think the Sri Lankan Tamil situation is in a different box altogether. But so I don't think from a national security calculus point of view, except for Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, we've never really confronted this situation. So the cause of, or should federalism or federal views really factor into the national security discourse? I have not really thought it through, but yes, I can say with certainty that the view from Bangalore about maybe what happens with Pakistan or from Chennai is very different from the view in New Delhi, and vice versa. For example, when you look at what happens down south from New Delhi, frankly, it doesn't really, is not really top priority, and that's why I had a naval guy telling me the other day that, sir, we in the Navy have to actually fight for everything because, we are so, the Army has such a heavy preponderance, and one of the ways that we do it is try and turn the map of India upside down. So yes, I guess where you sit also has a bearing on your perspectives, but till now we seem to have managed pretty well.
Okay, we have a question. Sorry, I forgot.
Good evening. I had a question regarding the future of India's national security. We've seen over the last decade how social media has been weaponized by, like Russia used it against the US during the presidential elections in 2016. Given that this is happening, is the National Security Council in India, does it view it as a threat, and is it taking any steps to deal with it?
Well, social media should be called unsocial media. In fact, it has become the purveyor of every negative manifestation that possibly is known to humankind. And so therefore, anonymity masquerading as privacy has not really helped the public discourse at all. Let me tell you that in the Data Protection Joint Committee, I was a very fervent advocate of all social media accounts being verified. Primarily because, while you're entitled to your privacy, but you're not entitled to weaponize the social media space. And then, of course, in 2013, you saw, what happened to students from the Northeast in Bangalore, in Chennai, etc., the kind of panic it can create. But the pushback was so strong because if Russia has weaponized social media, so have some of our political parties and done it fairly effectively. So I think there is a very, very strong case to step back and look at it from a larger national security perspective than a purely politically partisan perspective, which seems to be the lens at the moment, because in the months and days ahead, it is going to become a huge, it has already become a huge problem. So you see, at least the Facebook and the Twitter and the Instagram, etc., is publicly visible, so that you can take some action with regard to that if there's an inflammatory post or if something. But the real problem are the closed groups, the WhatsApp groups, the Telegram groups, the Signal groups. What goes on in those closed groups and the kind of havoc that they can cause is something which even if a government wants, is not able to monitor, because then there are issues of privacy, there are issues of encryption, and obviously companies are not willing to, let's say, part with proprietary encryption technology. But the potential of damage, and I'll give you two examples. During my own Lok Sabha election, I was fighting from a new constituency, predominantly agrarian constituency. It's called the Panthik constituency in Punjab because that's where the Sikh faith was founded. About 10 days into the election, these guys put out a video saying that the petrol to burn Sikhs in Delhi had come from my father's petrol pump. It's another matter that he was assassinated 6 months before this happened, but the damage that it caused, forget perceptual damage, but even the threat, the real threat to my family and I even today, because somebody may just take it to be gospel. And I have tried my best to get that video taken down. And despite filing an FIR, despite the case being challaned in court, that video remains on Facebook. I'll give you a second example. 2 days before the campaign, somebody put out a deep fake in my voice, abusing various communities in the most vile language possible. Of course, we were able to deal with it, but the fact is that the potential of misuse of social media and the fact that the companies are not willing to do anything at all, is something really scary. And this goes back to a larger debate which I had led when I was a minister in the government, that, you would require agreed rules of engagement in the virtual civilization. But unfortunately, the free speech absolutists and these big five of the internet world who control 90% of the traffic, they push back so strongly against any attempt to try and regulate the net. And ultimately what has happened as a result of that is that you've seen the balkanization of the net. See what China has done to the net. And if conflicts continue the way they are, in our lifetime, as we saw the rise of the net, as we know it today, we'll see the demise of the net. It's going to become a balkanized net. So therefore, this whole social media dimension, unfortunately, does not occupy a mind space in government, because people of my generation or people elder to me who were brought up in a brick and mortar civilization just don't kind of grasp it. I remember when we had the flash mob protests after the Nirbhaya incident in Delhi, and people actually, the flash mobs climbed onto the gates of Rashtrapati Bhavan. When we had a meeting to see as to how we could possibly contain it, I, to my horror, found that there was no institutional knowledge within government at all. So it still remains an entity that we've not really been able to wrap our heads around.
So we'll have to conclude the session. Gentlemen, any final thoughts that you would like to share with the audience? And even if you want to address a question that the gentleman asked.
I think the book, because there's so much of it in one place, would be of interest to anybody who's trying to get a glimpse of what and how and why the government of India has taken decisions on national security. But I think his main aim of actually using the book to educate his contemporaries in parliament and assemblies, that I hope will be met sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tiwari and General Menon. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the
Thank
Bangalore
you.
International Center and the Takshila Institute for organizing this.